There was a slight change in the program, and one of the things you do as a conference organizer is jump in and give a talk when one of your speakers don't show up. So the next speaker was supposed to be from Coca-Cola, and because there was a change in plans, you're going to hear her talk from me. So as Steve said, I direct this center, and I serve as the department head of management. Part of what I did a few years ago is wrote a book with a former executive MBA student from many years ago, Alex Zelikovsky. And the book, we titled the book Orchestrating Supply Chain Opportunities. And so the way I'm going to frame it is I'm going to frame business continuity related issues as supply chain opportunities. What I mean by that is this is an opportunity for a well-run system to rise to the occasion and save the day. So that's the way I'm going to frame it. Gary mentioned that the best way to get us thinking about issues is to sort of make them tangible. So what you're going to see is sort of a series of examples where I'll show you the example and ponder what can we learn from this example. Is there a principle that you can learn from this example? Now I know that the EMB class is in session, so maybe this can be something we can use as an exam question, one of these things. So I want to get you to sort of think along these lines. Gary brought up this idea of demand shocks, if you will, and supply shocks in addition to your own organization. So I want to get you to just sort of imagine something unexpected happens that throws things out of control. So for example, business declines, demand spikes, natural disasters, new technologies that come up. And so for each of them, what I'm going to try to do is to give you a tangible example of something that happened, and I'm going to let you ponder whether the choices they made are good choices. I'm not claiming they are, but there were choices that were made. So again, think about a short window, so you don't have a long time to sit and agonize over what you want to do. Something happens, you get the ball rolling and have to. The opportunity to react is over a short time window. So hurricanes. Many of us have been reading about hurricanes. You've certainly been reading about what happened in Puerto Rico. So this is something that happened, of course, earlier, which is Hurricane Katrina. And when that happened, we had a project going on with the US Coast Guard. And this is the part that I found amazing. So we were working with the Air Division of the Coast Guard. Incidentally, some of you who say, you're Purdue, what do you have to do with the Coast Guard? Right? We're far from the coast. Well, actually, it turns out that any Coast Guard officer who wants to get an MBA has been coming to Purdue since the late 60s. So the entire management structure of the Coast Guard consists of Krannert graduates. So our connection to them is some of the students in our class who took our core classes said, hey, how come we're not using what you're teaching us? And so we said, well, we can solve that problem. So they said, okay, fine. We're in charge of this facility in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, which you go to Norfolk. And incidentally, if you want to go there, you drive by the Great Dismal Swamp. If you haven't driven by it, it's an actual thing. You can Google it, the Great Dismal Swamp. So anyway, you go by this Great Dismal Swamp and you reach Elizabeth City, and that's where their Air Division is located. And so we were working in the Air Division, and despite the fact that there was so much activity going on that the Coast Guard was involved in, on the repair side, we didn't see much of a blip. So here was a question: how could there be so much activity in which they were involved in with very little that we could see when we were looking at maintenance? And so I want to get you to sort of think about what happened during Katrina. I'm going to talk about operationally what happened. So again, it was a very severe disaster, a lot of deaths, $200 billion in damages. And of the 60,000 people rescued, the Coast Guard rescued 33,500 people over a 2-week period. And that, incidentally, the activity they put in and the amount of rescue they did was equivalent to what they had done in a year in the past. Okay. 43 aircraft, 2,000 personnel, and effectively everybody got involved somehow. But the interesting thing at the end of it all, that the bill that was submitted by the Coast Guard was under 20 million. It was the smallest bill submitted. Okay. So it's worth sort of thinking about, how does an organization jump in, do a tremendous task at a fairly modest cost? So in this grand video, what it actually shows you is how all of the assets were repositioned as a function of time.
This video shows the asset adjustment as Hurricane Katrina arrives in New Orleans. Notice the helicopters moving away and moving back as the hurricane unfolds. Notice all the helicopters redeployed to distant locations. Notice them accumulating back in Mobile and New Orleans. Notice assets being transferred from other air stations to this crisis location.
Okay. So what the Coast Guard did is, as they saw the hurricane coming in, they moved all of the equipment away so they would not be affected by the hurricane. As the hurricane moved away, they started bringing in all the equipment, following the tail of the hurricane. And as the volumes went, all the air stations throughout the country reprioritized their tasks and fed capacity to deal with this problem. So the idea here was that if you had an agile strategy that allowed you to shuffle your resources, reprioritize your tasks, you can actually absorb this big shock by coming together to deal with it without increasing costs. Okay? So the two messages here are what might be called the flexibility with which you redeploy and relocate your resources, and sort of the agility with which you deal with this huge increase in volume. The basic message here was that what they ended up doing is, from the point of view of their equipment itself, because they just reshuffled the tasks they did, at the back end, it did not increase costs as much. Okay, so that's what they did to deal with the problem. And so one of the things, if you're curious, you can do a Google search to see what did they do? How did they actually manage this process? The Office of Management and Budget has a study on the Coast Guard and what they did to get this to happen. And they identify a bunch of things. The Coast Guard spends a lot of time training, which also means that any random group of personnel who have never worked together can dynamically come together and execute a task. One of the things that was very salient during Katrina is that when they actually deployed, one of the things that was destroyed during Katrina was the communication system. So nobody could communicate with each other. So even though all these aircraft had gone in, one of the commanders decided, she just decided that I'm going to become the communications hub. I'm not going to spend my time airlifting people, but I'm going to be the communications hub, and I'm going to basically allow all the assets to communicate with each other. Her decision allowed everybody else to work effectively, and she didn't require any permission to take that decision, announce it to everybody, and move forward. So some of the things that this brings up is the benefit of structuring a system to enable such a response allowed them to execute with very little additional cost. So from a management perspective, there's some interesting learning. It isn't, there are things you can do materially in how you set up the system that enables you to deal with these shocks. Now, several of the Coast Guard officers say that what they do on a given morning is they're told there's going to be a problem that you haven't heard of that you're going to solve today. Okay. Now, what will that problem be? The problem can be an issue in one place. The problem could be, take off from Atlantic City and guard Washington, D.C. The problem could be something else. And whatever it is, it's in many cases, they're ready to deal with the surprise. But they're also told, while you're dealing with the surprise, don't expect to have a lot of extra resources. You've got to make do by coming together. So that's an interesting story that came out of this. There's also a sub-story with it. When you study Katrina and hurricanes like this, corporations play a very big role in gaining goodwill by setting themselves up. So basically, the public realizes that they performed a service. So Walmart, for example, had decided that they were going to freeze all prices to pre-hurricane levels. They would not increase prices. They would provide a service. They basically started donating truckloads of water and various other sort of services. They offered trucking capacity to move donated goods. They provided free prescription refills. They paid the utilities for donated space available for relief. So just as just as the Coast Guard does its thing, this is also an opportunity for a corporation to step up. And one should not discount the goodwill that comes out of doing the right thing and organizing yourself for doing that. Walmart is not the only entity. The Home Depot also came in and played such a role. And in many cases, the federal government actually sometimes relies on the private sector to jump in and basically help orchestrate themselves, because the expectation is that the decision making is much faster. And it can operate. Now this has become a little more standard. Many companies already have sort of crisis centers that bring things together. I want to switch gears and get you to think about bicycle locks. So if you're a bicyclist, one of the things that people used to have is something called the kryptonite lock. So the kryptonite lock was developed in 1972 by Chicago Lock, and of course in true New York fashion, there's a forget about it lock. And this forget about it lock basically promised $3,500 that they would contribute towards replacement of your bicycle if somebody broke the lock and took your bicycle. Okay, so that was their market position. And so here's what the video did. The video basically started with a Bic pen. You took the back of a Bic pen, put it in the lock, and jiggled it a little bit, and basically you could break the lock. So this video appeared, and they told everybody, hey, you want to break a lock? Break a lock. Here's how you do it.
This is a Kryptonite Evolution 2000 lock. I used to use this to lock up my bike around here in Seattle until I found out that you can take a Bic pen and just remove the top and just pop it into the lock and just do a couple of little quick twists and turns, and voila, your lock and your bike is completely compromised. So, way to go, Kryptonite.
Now, notice that if you're a manufacturer, this is sort of the worst thing that can happen to you. Sergio, I don't know anything about Tide Pod eating. That's the other option, which is the video. But we'll stay away from that. So what happened? Well, it actually turned out that this Kryptonite lock video created a blog storm. And so lots of people started seeing it. And notice that this is a bit of a public relations nightmare. Because you've sold everybody, as Gary said, you've sold this insurance that your bike is guaranteed for $3,500, and the world now knows that it can be picked with a Bic pen. Now, I don't know what happened to sales of Bic pens as a result. I have no idea. But what I do know, that suddenly the idea that this is an unbreakable lock was in question. Now, here's the part that was interesting. The entire industry had used that particular technology for locks. So while everybody was focusing on Kryptonite, this was the entire bicycle lock industry that was in question. So what did they do? The company actually kept very quiet for a period of time. And in fact, because they were quiet, the internet was abuzz with this is the grossest example of incompetence of a company, that senior management did nothing. That was the initial point. However, what they did is took their time very quickly to come up with an alternate design, and they gave a promise to every owner that they would honor the guarantee and give you a free replacement. No questions asked. They said, we're good for everything we told you. Here's a brand new lock. If you had an old lock to trade in, don't worry about it. It'll cover everything. And guess what happened? Most customers didn't come back to get a new lock. There was hardly any payment. And the only problem was, because they were ready to stand up and be counted and say, hey, it's available, it's not your fault, it's our error, we'll fix it, it just ended in a whimper. So all that criticism of the company saying you didn't do anything at the end became, oh, this was a brilliant strategy, that you took responsibility, you basically told everybody don't worry about it, you allowed them to maintain the trust in you, because you said, if it's a problem, it's our problem, not your problem. And this is something that's sort of interesting. It's something which all companies who have various technologies, you never know where somebody is going to identify a problem. Notice that there are many, many things that someday somebody will announce, and there'll be a study in the New England Journal of Medicine or something else in which they identify there's a chemical that has this harmful reaction or something of that sort. And the first thing you do is run to see if you're using that chemical. And if you're using that chemical, then you're in trouble, because you now need to go through the entire supply chain, take away all the old product, replace the new, and take the responsibility. And this is an example. The one thing that's interesting about this is the importance of social media in getting people to know about this video. It's a lot faster than waiting for it to appear in the New York Times and reading it and responding. And this is something that's sort of interesting. This is an example of sort of a technology-related shock.
Peter, come take a look at this. Mr. Daniels.
Look at this. What's this?
The numbers, they keep getting bigger and bigger.
The clicks are off the charts.
Yeah.
Yoshi, it's Walter. We're back.
Yes, sir!
I need more trees. More trees? I'll get you more trees.
Hey, take a look at wood pulp.
Whoa. Everything you got on wood pulp right now.
He really loves that thing.
This was an example of a demand increase. So the demand increase for a book. So you see this video of this demand increase, and then all of a sudden, as the demand increases, orders increase, the publisher starts increasing, wood pulp demand goes up, the market reacts to wood pulp. You see a tremendous amount of enthusiasm building up, and you see fabulous. And then finally, you see a little child sitting in front of an iPad, busily hitting buy, 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 buy. Okay? So the one thing to note is that it's quite possible that you have a false signal. Okay? So when you look at information systems, sometimes what happens is, and this, by the way, happened when we were working with the Coast Guard. There were several examples of if we just blindly followed the data, we would have days in which there would be 1 million units shipped. And you knew there couldn't be 1 million units shipped. There was a bug. And so rather than 1, the entry was 1 million. Okay? And if you had blindly followed the 1 million and all the systems followed that thing and nobody looked at it, we would have a much bigger business continuity problem than if you nipped it in the bud. So that's something that some of you may have heard of, the bullwhip effect. And very often, if you sort of blindly follow data, you get things like that. I wanted to just briefly mention one last thing, and I think this is related to something that's sort of concrete and difficult, and this is the United Nations and humanitarian logistics. So humanitarian logistics is something in which, first, there's a lot more of it that we need right now. So for example, over 35 million people in the world depend on emergency relief, and every year $6 to $8 billion are spent on relief efforts. And one of the things that's interesting is sometimes all of this relief comes in a very uncoordinated fashion just because of the nature of funding. For example, the European Commission for Humanitarian Relief has a rule, and I'll tell you what the rule is, and you can ponder the impact of the rule. They have a rule saying the majority of the funding will go to the aid organization that is in position at the location of the disaster and whose logo is visible on CNN. So what you're doing is, there's an earthquake. Now there's a mad dash to be the first person, and most relief organizations have their logos painted on their Jeeps in broad, so you can see it very clearly. Why? So that the CNN cameras can pick them up. If you're there on site and deployed, and you're the first, you get the funding. You notice that this is not a good strategy to encourage collaboration. In fact, if anything, I'm going to send a fake location to go in this direction, the true one in that direction, have all of you follow me to this location. All of this happens. So that's the difficulty, that there are a lot of entities, but they are uncoordinated. So what ends up happening in these kinds of contexts, when you think about business continuity, is there's an expectation that there'll be a group that goes in, ramps up, settles things down, and leaves. Okay? So the expectation is you're not going to be around for a while. You're going to be a temporary fix to help things get back in faction and leave. Many of you who are following what's happening in Puerto Rico are understanding that there's a question as to when can you leave, have things been stabilized, etc. So there's ramp up, execution, ramp down. And I just want to, I can't resist putting on my professor hat. So when you think about this, there actually happen to be 3 strategies that are studied by the United Nations. So those of you who are interested, the United Nations has a group called Lessons Learned Unit. And the Lessons Learned Unit basically looks at how these disasters were managed and steps back across all of them and says, what are ways you can manage or really structure them? So there are 3 ways that they structure that management can happen when you're dealing with a disaster. The first is called management by default. Okay? Management by default is really nothing other than information will be provided. Each of you make your decisions. Okay? No coordination. But there's a second group, which is management by consensus. And that is that there are many people with specific priorities. We're going to call a meeting, we're going to convene a meeting, and people are going to decide how it's going to happen. There's no central decision maker, it's by consensus. Okay. And the third is management by command. Somebody takes over and says, okay, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this, and here's how we're going to get this done. Okay. Now, as you read this, each of you have your own choice regarding how you manage, but notice that for most of us, all 3 are appropriate, just depending on the context. Okay. And the key question is, because sometimes if you use the wrong management style for the problem, you end up creating a much bigger problem. I'm going to give you a few examples in each of these. So the first was, this is an example of coordination by consensus. So this was in Rwanda way back when the World Food Program was flying in food and flying out empty, whereas the United Nations Humanitarian Relief was flying in empty and flying out full. So you say, voila, here's the brilliant strategy. Bring in food, take out refugees. You got increased utilization. But remember, what seems like an easy thing, be careful. Because when you need to take refugees out, it's because they're in danger and you have to leave now. But when you're bringing food in, you have to wait for the food to arrive. So even though this seems like an easy statement, in order to get this to happen, you need coordination between 2 very powerful entities, the World Food Program and UNHCR. Just on a side note, there's another level of coordination which makes this very complicated, and I'll just mention it to you, but it's each of you decide. The World Food Program's mission is to feed hungry people, period. Okay. Now, other entities might decide we only want to feed the hungry good people. Those are 2 different things. Feeding people and feeding the hungry good people are 2 different things, because who decides good? It's the donor. So these are the good people, I'm going to feed them. These other people, I want them to be hungry because they're not good people, right? So because of this difference, these things are not easy. So just as an example, this is called coordination by consensus. Nobody decided they needed to coordinate routes, etc. Sometimes it's just a write board, okay? Just a bulletin. And people decide, individual NGOs decide. But what I want to get you to think about, how might you find sort of, a 3x3 matrix? Remember, for all of you students, anytime you see a matrix, the answer is the diagonal. Okay? Is it the left diagonal or the right diagonal? That's the difference. But the answer is always the diagonal, right? You know the answer. So of course, here's the diagonal, and you think about the fact that maybe the nature of the intervention should depend on the nature of it. I want to sort of briefly mention, so in our book we talk about this framework which we call FAR, flexibility, agility, and real options. And so we have a little story, we have a bunch of methodologies on how you actually build in these capabilities into a supply chain. So what's a quick summary? A quick summary is that when you think about organizations and you think about what might happen, there are certain things you can do at the start to enable the ability to respond. And enabling the ability to respond means building in the competencies, building in the ability to reprioritize, finding a way to operate so that you rise to the occasion. What that occasion is could vary a lot. I picked a few examples. We have a whole bunch of other examples in our book. But the thing that's sort of interesting about this is that this is the capability that sometimes is the capability that delivers the high margins. The routine jobs deliver a base set of margins, but rising to the occasion is what delivers the high margin. So I'm going to stop at this point. We're going to have an opportunity to talk again when we reconvene. Thank you for listening.